Well, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs is still concerned for the well-being of a number of Australians who are unaccounted for. Our political editor, Chris Ullman, is standing by in our Canberra studio, and with him is the Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd.
Thanks, Lee, and Foreign Minister, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me on the program.
Now, the National Security Committee of Cabinet has been meeting this afternoon. What can you tell us about Australians missing in Japan?
Based on our most recent information, we have information that we have 143 unaccounted for Australians in the disaster-affected areas. The reason we use that term unaccounted for is because we are matching up the list of names, registered and otherwise, who we have a reasonable basis to believe that they were in the disaster-affected areas, but people with whom we have not yet been able to establish direct contact.
So some people are registered, but other families have been contacting you saying that we believe that our relative was in this area.
Exactly, and that is the great challenge we, of course, in our own Consular Services Centre face, dealing with the registered list, which is always less than the actual number of Australians in a particular area.
Do you hold grave concerns for them at this stage because, of course, it may take them time to make contact?
No, that's not a term we use because we are simply seeking to be methodical. And our previous experience of natural disasters, whether it's in Christchurch or elsewhere, does see these numbers come down. But I'm just being frank with you, that's where the data now stands, based on the most recent advice from the Department of Foreign Affairs Crisis Centre here in Canberra.
I assume that calls are still coming into that centre, though.
On the numbers of calls, my recollection is that as of today we have received, I think, in excess of 7,000 calls. And when you add that to the number of registered Australians within the country, and then come up with a further list of those we've been able to make contact with, you can understand the complexity of the task. What we are seeking to do with each of those calls is to respond to them as they are legitimately anxious about their friends, their family and their loved ones. But it does take time. We have something like 220 staff working on this through the centre here in Canberra. We've got something in excess of 60 consular staff, effective consular staff on the ground in Japan.
Now, we've seen growing concerns about those nuclear facilities. What's your advice to Australians in Japan at the moment?
Based on the discussions we have had today, and really within the last hour or two, with the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Authority, we don't have a basis at this stage to move from the existing travel advice concerning the 20-kilometre exclusion zone from the Fukushima nuclear plant, and in the 10 kilometres beyond that, that is between 20 and 30 kilometres, for people to remain indoors. That is the advice that we have provided at present. At this stage, we have no basis to change that.
How hard is it for Australians to get out of Japan at the moment? Because there must be a lot of pressure on travel.
We have a consular team also based at Narita Airport who are assisting with Australians getting onto flights. My most recent advice is that flights were still departing, broadly according to their schedules, but with some delays, as you can imagine. The reason we've got a team out there is to assist Australians who, whatever reason, because of bad traffic and everything else, unable to meet their scheduled flights. We're also, for anyone who's been in disaster-affected areas, providing passport identification, of course, free of charge.
Now, there are some 11,000 Australians in Japan, we believe. Do you have contingency plans just in case you need to start moving them quickly?
The government seeks to be methodical about each of these matters. Firstly, through our technical experts, both in terms of the tsunami impact and, of course, any concerns about radiation, we are taking advice from the relevant authorities here in Australia. The Australian Radiation Protection Agency, the Nuclear Safety Authority, they are providing us with ongoing assessment on that basis, and that continues as we speak into this evening. But you rightly raised the question about contingency planning. Not only are we reflecting the technical advice we get from the field and from the agencies into our travel advisories, it also follows that we are making contingency planning in terms of anything which may arise, including the resources which may be necessary for that as well.
Now, has the Japanese government asked for any more assistance from Australia?
In the last 24 hours, they've accepted our offer of assistance for the C-17 aircraft, which is on the ground in Japan. It is itself today flown 2 sorties for the Japanese government. The C-17s are huge aircraft. They're heavy lift aircraft. We use them in Afghanistan a lot. The Japanese don't have them. So we've been transporting all sorts of land vehicles for the Japanese, as well as large supplies of fresh water. So they've taken that up. As for our search and rescue team, they are on the ground in a centre in the broad Sendai area. I had the name of it here a minute ago. It is one of the most devastated towns, called Minami Sanriku. That's where our team is, with embedded translators and interpreters. They're working with the Japanese and, I believe, the Kiwis on reconnaissance now before they get down to the job.
Now, to other matters, and particularly Libya, you were among the most...
Can I just add one other thing before we go to Libya, is that this nuclear situation on the ground out of Fukushima we take seriously. If there is any further developments on this score, we will of course advise the Australian public immediately, and we're working with the Japanese, as we are working with the International Atomic Energy Agency and the National Nuclear Regulatory Authority of the United States, and this work continues through the night.
Okay. Now, you were one of the loudest voices calling for a no-fly zone over Libya. Just how many Australian planes did you offer when you were in meetings talking about this? What
I said very explicitly, and I've done so for the last 2 weeks, is say that this lies in a zone of immediate contiguousness to the NATO countries of Europe. Very explicit from day one in saying that when it comes to no-fly zones, if they were declared in our part of the world, in our immediate region, then of course we would be seized of our responsibilities and consider it.
Sure, but you can understand why the Americans are not as enthusiastic as you are about a no-fly zone, because it would fall to them, probably in the end, to enforce it.
Well, the bottom line is, adjacent to Libya, you have a whole range of NATO air forces who have a range of capabilities who within an hour or two of flying distance from Libya. That's the bottom line. And I've been consistent about that. The second point I'd make is this. A number of countries around the world have been explicit in saying that a no-fly zone is necessary to protect maximally the Libyan population on the ground, the civilian population. Countries who may be geographically removed or for whatever reason do not have the air capacity to assist. Australia's diplomacy has been consistent on this.
Robert Gates, who was the US Defence Secretary, who may have to do this, and usually it does fall to the United States, is not as enthusiastic, and he basically says, let's call a spade a spade. That begins, a no-fly zone begins, with bombing their air defences. Is that the way you would see it beginning?
The precise shape of a no-fly zone is a matter for active contingency planning within NATO.
He says that's the way it begins, and he should know.
Well, there are a range of contingencies in terms of the shape of a no-fly zone. And that's what NATO is working on, from one level of a no-fly zone to another. The operational need, which underpins Australian policy, is this. The land operations at present by the Libyan ground forces are being in part assisted by Libyan reconnaissance aircraft, and from time to time by bombing and strafing from the air. That's the operational reality.
Do you appreciate, though, that when you set up a no-fly zone, you are going to be forced to bomb facilities on the ground and shoot down planes in the air? So it is an act of war over Libya.
If you have an action authorised by the United Nations Security Council, it is authorised under international law. That's why...
It's still an act of war.
It is an act to defend the collective security of the states of the United Nations, consistent with the provisions of the UN Charter. That's why it was put there in the first place. And the second thing is this. In terms of the operation on the ground, I can understand why the Americans would wish to hang back and wait for a lead from the Arab League, the contiguous states. That came forth on Saturday when the Arab League foreign minister said, yes, we support one.
But they won't pay for it, and they won't put planes up.
And they want to see what the NATOs will do in Europe as well. The British and the French, through NATO, are undertaking contingency planning. The key thing here lies in the UN Security Council, and the Australian policy is very clear. We support the UN Security Council considering this matter. We also call upon the UN Security Council to respond positively to what the foreign ministers of the Arab countries of the region have said.
To finish, Foreign Minister, obviously the Labor Party has never supported nuclear power in Australia, but do you think that argument now is well and truly buried by what we're seeing in Japan?
You know something, Chris? I don't think it's quite the right time for this debate. We're dealing with the immediate crisis on the ground in Japan, which is consular, these nuclear matters as well. It's going to take some time. The position of the Australian government has been always clear as far as the nuclear energy option for Australia is concerned. And that's the policy which has been outlined by the Australian Labor Party in its platform. That's the policy of this government. That continues to be the policy of this government.
Foreign Minister, thank you.
Thanks for having me on the program.